Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to discuss the change in the civil rights movement as youth activism in the 1960s starts to expand, and where the civil rights movement becomes somewhat more confrontational. And at the same time, we're going to talk about the foreign crises leading to, potential problems and the almost destruction of the world. So, this is Lesson 9, The Rise of the New Left. Here are our objectives for today. Let's take a moment and then dive in. So young people in the United States had been becoming more politically active in the generation after World War II. Young people, as we talked about, had become kind of an economic force during the 1920s, but we're going to see a rise in youth political activism during this time period. And this is going to be pushed, at least in the start, generally by you people in universities, by college-educated, middle and upper middle class people. The sort of manifesto of the New Left is going to be the Port Huron Statement by Tom Hayden here from a group called Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. So take a moment, read, and let's move on. The Port Huron Statement and groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Students for a Democratic Society start to question a lot of the norms and a lot of the things that they've been told about American society. They start looking at the founding values and documents of the country and noting the ways in which we fall short of these things. And with the sort of traditional idealism of youth, they dive in to tackle these problems, trying to force the United States to live up to its goals, with the type of sort of, again, youthful and some would say naive idealism that young people often have, pushing for change and to some extent ignoring or choosing to trying to overcome the institutional barriers that have led to all of these things happening in the first place. So all of this is going to be part of, quote unquote, the new left. These young people are going to mostly identify with the Democratic Party, which is going to be, after FDR, the party of sort of change and government-sponsored reform. And it's going to be a political reorganization that's going to have lasting consequences up until, honestly, currently today. You could see a lot of the sort of the roots of the modern progressive movement in the rise of the New Left in the early 1960s. Civil rights is one of the things that young people are going to take on. Specifically, groups like the Congress on Racial Equality are going to push for sort of a not stunts is the wrong word, but I guess I would say, and they're not really civil disobedience either, because you're not really pushing unjust laws, but they're going to bend social norms in order to highlight discrimination and issues like that. So sit-ins are an example of this. Sit-ins start with the Greensboro Four, some 4 college students from Greensboro, North Carolina, who decide to go in and sit at a popular lunch place, Woolworth's Deli Counter. This establishment did not serve African Americans, at least not in the restaurant itself. If Black people wanted to get a meal from Woolworths, they had to come in through the kitchen and then take it to go, which these students thought was inequitable, of course, because, discrimination. And, Brown v. Board clearly stated that segregation is not okay. But at the same time, we still see this Jim Crow establishment present throughout the South, and Southerners have found ways to work around Supreme Court rulings and push back against this stuff. And so the sit-ins created a scene, and then generally a mob would show up and the restaurant would close down. And the goal of the people participating in the sit-in would be to continue to show up and force the restaurant and the community to respond to it until economically it became too costly for the restaurant, both, from the losing business because of them shutting down, but also because of the negative publicity that all of this was generating. And so they're going to force integration. This was successful in Greensboro and is quickly going to spread to other cities with people participating in these sit-ins. I don't want to understate how dangerous it was for the people involved in this. Obviously, mob violence and threats from others was a real fear. And for a lot of these young people, they were risking their lives in order to fight for justice. And so I'm not trying to trivialize their experience at all. And it was a very successful model that's going to lead to integration of a lot of businesses throughout sort of the upper South in areas like that. The Freedom Rides were another example on this. The Supreme Court, it was theoretically illegal to segregate on interstate transport. And so the Freedom Riders were going to get on some buses and drive across the Jim Crow South with a sort of an integrated passenger ship in order to highlight the sort of danger of this. Southerners vowed to stop these freedom rides, advocating that it was simply out-of-towners coming in to try to create problems where there weren't any, and that Black people in the South were happy with segregation. And the result was, when they went into across the Deep South, you should read this, take a moment, pause, and the buses were attacked. The Freedom Riders were attacked. The buses were bombed, and it forced the Kennedy administration to respond to this, to make federal statements, to send in federal troops in some instances to protect Freedom Riders. And the second round of Freedom Riders were successful, and integrated travel on buses became the norm. So here's the experience of the Freedom Riders. It was unbelievably traumatic for these people to be attacked and to be almost killed by these mobs. And the publicity that it generated pushed the Kennedy administration to start making positive statements about civil rights. So here's your Freedom Rides, traveling mostly across the Deep South, and in the end, they were successful at integrating buses and interstate transit. The Kennedy administration would struggle to embrace civil rights fully because of the Democratic coalition really needing the Deep Southerners. They were afraid of the type of primary challenges like Truman faced in '48, and that their base of support was not strong enough to survive that type of sort of revolt within the party. And so although the Kennedy administration made some statements about integration, they really didn't have the political will to pass anything large scale. The free speech movement expanded the power of college students on campuses. This started at Berkeley. Up until this point, universities had very strict dress codes and codes of conduct. And so the free speech movement involved students breaking these dress codes and these codes of conduct, speaking out about political issues, inviting political speakers to campuses, and getting a lot of these rules overturned. Of course, it also involved a lot of them getting arrested and a significant crackdown from college administrators at first. But over time, it led to college campuses becoming more of an environment in which people could share ideas, could share sort of different political points of view, and sort of broke the traditional conservative orthodoxy on college campuses. And so moved them in a way that they could be more inclusive to a variety of different sort of perspectives. So for civil rights, we've got the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is MLK's group. MLK worked intentionally to try to cross the lines and to bring white people, especially middle-class white people, into the movement. He saw that was important both for a public relations standpoint and also to get access to greater financial resources. And so his movement to try to push civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance included a mixed Black and white crowd generally. One of their least successful campaigns was the Albany Campaign, where they were trying to desegregate all public facilities in Albany. They protested and occupied public spaces, and the police nonviolently arrested them. They were bailed out and then protested again, and then they were arrested again. And in general, there wasn't a massive public outcry, and there wasn't a lot of change. And so the Albany Campaign taught people a couple different things. One, you needed to have much more specifically targeted goals. And two, you needed to provoke a disproportionate response for the authorities. And so with that in mind, they targeted the city of Birmingham for their next direct action campaign. Birmingham was an incredibly segregated city in Alabama, led by Bull Connor, the police commissioner was Bull Connor. He was an outspoken white supremacist, and he vowed to crush any of these protests with the appropriate levels of force. And so Birmingham was a place in which the Southern Christian Leadership Campaign felt like they could get the type of response that they needed in order to generate the public support that they wanted. A couple different things distinguished the Birmingham campaign. The first was that MLK and his associates decided not to bail themselves out of jail. So as opposed to Albany, where they were arrested, bailed out, and then arrested again, in Birmingham, they simply filled up the jails. MLK wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail while in custody in Birmingham, and then they continued to protest, famously using school children. School children were brought out to protest, and Bull Connor responded with police dogs, with high pressure fire hoses. And so we got images of these high schoolers marching, getting sprayed with fire hoses, being attacked by police dogs, and it put a ton of pressure on the city in general and on the administration to really take a stance and do something. This was making the United States look incredibly bad on the world stage. And so the Birmingham campaign showed the advantages of provoking a disproportionate response. Here's his letter from a Birmingham jail. This laying out sort of the justification for coming into Birmingham and disrupting. And as a result of this, they planned a larger campaign, the March on Washington, using the public support gained from Birmingham to push for a larger piece of civil rights legislation, some type of overarching government action that would deal with all of these problems in all of these localities, as opposed to having to strike down each segregationist law in each segregationist city individually. And so the March on Washington was incredibly successful, again, putting pressure on the Kennedy administration, although to some degree it's also controversial within the civil rights movement as far as its scope, its goals, its cooperation with authorities. And this is really going to be sort of the high watermark of civil rights, pushing for greater change. Of course, the I Have a Dream speech is the most famous thing to come out of this. You should definitely read the entire thing, but here's just an excerpt, so pause. The last piece is going to be the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution, of course, happened under the Eisenhower administration, the overthrow of our hand-picked Banana Republic dictator by Castro after years of guerrilla fighting, and the establishment of a communist country in Cuba. And so this is problematic, of course, because it was not always guaranteed that Castro was going to go communist. But in the aftermath of the overthrow, especially with the U.S.'s hostility to his reign, you see the cozying up with Khrushchev and the growth of communism within Cuba. So this is pretty problematic for us, obviously. The Kennedy administration spectacularly failed with the Bay of Pigs invasion. The plan for Bay of Pigs was a plan that had been developed under the Eisenhower administration. We had a bunch of Cuban refugees that we were going to arm and drop off in Cuba. They were then going to, with U.S. air support, start a general revolution, overthrow the Castro administration, and restore capitalism and democracy to the island. There's a number of different accounts on why it failed, so definitely go in and read the accounts of like what happened here. The short of it is the Cubans were far more prepared for this than we thought. Their intelligence network was much more developed than we were prepared for, and the air support never actually materialized. And there's a couple different accounts of why Kennedy didn't send in the planes. The general consensus is, was worried it would start World War III and wasn't super decisive. And so the Bay of Pigs, the invaders were captured, revealed American involvement. It was a massive humiliation for the United States, and it gave Khrushchev the political capital necessary to begin the construction of the Berlin Wall across the city of Berlin to stop the flow of refugees out of the occupied city. The other consequence of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion is the somewhat understandable fear by the Castro regime that the United States might assassinate Castro or overthrow his government. And so this led to closer connections between Castro and the USSR under Khrushchev, specifically leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. A U-2 flyover of Cuba in November of 1962 revealed that the Cubans were installing intercontinental ballistic missile sites on the island of Cuba with Soviet weapons. This kicked off an immediate crisis in the United States for what I hope are obvious reasons, because of course the proximity of the island of Cuba to the United States meant that the warning time before one of our cities explodes was down to minutes, down from potentially hours. So that is absolutely a problem. Kennedy's going to order a blockade of Cuba to prevent needed parts from arriving on the island so the missiles could not actually be completed. Khrushchev sent a fleet to go escort the ships to make sure they got into Cuba. And now we've got this arm wrestling match / staring match / a game of chicken with both sides readying nuclear weapons to potentially go to war. This revealed a whole bunch of different problems because, of course, the conflict escalated as both sides refused to back down, and didn't seem to be any way out of this without one of the two sides spectacularly losing face. It also revealed that our lines of communication with the Soviet Union were relatively underdeveloped in that we had to rely on set translators. We had to rely on, third parties to go between. We had to passing these sort of notes back and forth, often with hours of delay time or even, half a day of delay time when both sides are readying nuclear missiles to potentially destroy each other. And so, in the end, we ended up reaching an accord, a secret agreement in which Khrushchev agreed to formally and publicly back down and remove the missiles, and Kennedy agreed to not invade Cuba and for the secret removal of missiles from Turkey. So, in the end, this ended up massively crushing Khrushchev politically, and he's going to be removed from his office as head of his position as head of the Soviet Union after this. But in the end, Kennedy wins the Cuban Missile Crisis, becomes a hero for not destroying the world, and Khrushchev becomes mostly forgotten, despite the fact that, again, he had a pretty large role to play in the world not ending in 1962. This was probably the closest we came to nuclear annihilation, as both parties were potentially ready to fire their missiles. And if those ships had started firing at each other, who knows? I mean, as my father said, his sixth grade teacher told him that, to have a good weekend as they went home in November of 62, and that they would probably all be dead by the morning. So, yeah. We admitted or agreed to secretly remove our missiles from Turkey because Kennedy could not appear to look weak on communism. And in general, we're going to establish a hotline, a direct telegraph line between Moscow and Washington to be able to directly communicate. And we're also going to try to develop, new ways of responding to this stuff, more surgical, interventions. We're going to create the Green Berets, a group of special forces that can accomplish more limited objectives. And Kennedy is going to embrace what's called flexible response instead of MAD to hopefully give us more options as opposed to nuking everybody. And so that brings us to the conclusion for today. When we come back next time, we'll dive into the assassination of Kennedy, the larger civil rights movement, and the beginning of the Johnson administration's domestic policies. So for now, thank you for listening.